Throughout history, we romanticize the medieval period with tales of noble knights and grand castles. But beneath the surface of these fairy tales lies a brutal reality that most people never learn about. The vast majority of medieval society consisted of serfs and peasants who lived lives of unimaginable hardship, and when death came for them, it rarely arrived with mercy or dignity. Today we're diving into the darkest corners of medieval history to uncover the most horrifying deaths suffered by the forgotten masses. These aren't the dramatic battlefield endings of kings and nobles that fill our history books. These are the brutal, systematic, and often sadistic deaths of ordinary people whose only crime was being born into the wrong social class. What you're about to hear will shock you. These accounts come from court records, monastery chronicles, and archaeological evidence that paint a picture so disturbing that historians have often avoided discussing them in detail. But understanding these deaths reveals the true nature of medieval power structures and the expendable value placed on human life. The first case takes us to a small village in northern France during the harsh winter of 1347. A serf named Guillaume had been accused of stealing grain from his lord's storehouse. The evidence was circumstantial at best, but medieval justice rarely required certainty when dealing with the lower classes. Guillaume was dragged from his hovel on a frozen morning in December. His wife and children watched helplessly as armed men bound his hands with rough hemp rope that cut deep into his wrists. The village lord had decided to make an example that would ensure no other serf would dare touch his property. The method chosen was deliberate in its cruelty. Guillaume was stripped naked and forced to his knees in the village square. The frozen ground bit into his bare flesh as spectators gathered, not by choice, but by command. Failure to witness the Lord's justice was itself a punishable offense. What followed defied every principle of quick execution. A brazier filled with glowing coals was brought forward. Iron brands bearing the Lord's seal were heated until they glowed white-hot. The first brand was pressed against Guillaume's chest, searing through skin and muscle. His screams echoed off the stone walls of surrounding buildings. But this was only the beginning. Each brand was applied with methodical precision. His shoulders, his back, his thighs. The smell of burning flesh filled the winter air. Guillaume's voice grew hoarse from screaming until finally no sound emerged from his throat at all. The branding continued for nearly an hour. When the irons finally cooled, Guillaume's body was a map of burned flesh and exposed bone. He was still alive, his eyes moving frantically as shock set in. The Lord's men then poured boiling water over the fresh wounds, causing what remained of his skin to peel away in strips. Death came slowly. Guillaume lingered for 3 more hours, his breathing shallow and labored. When he finally succumbed, his body was left in the square for days as a warning. The winter cold preserved his remains, a grotesque reminder of the price of defying authority. Our second account comes from England during the reign of King John. In the year 1208, a peasant woman named Margot was accused of witchcraft after several children in her village fell ill with fever. The accusation came from the local priest, who claimed she had cursed the well water during a dispute over tithes. Margot was 60 years old and had served as the village midwife for decades. Her knowledge of herbs and healing had saved countless lives, but in an age of superstition, such knowledge could easily be twisted into evidence of supernatural malevolence. The trial was a mockery of justice. Margot was subjected to the water ordeal, bound hand and foot, and thrown into the village pond. When she floated, as most bodies naturally do, it was taken as proof of her guilt. The water, it was said, rejected her corrupted soul. What followed was a torture session designed to extract a confession. Margot was taken to the Lord's castle and confined in a stone cell barely large enough for her body. For days, she was given no food or water, while interrogators demanded she admit to consorting with demons. When starvation failed to break her, more aggressive methods were employed. Her fingers were crushed one by one using iron screws designed for the purpose. Each digit was systematically destroyed, the bones grinding audibly as the metal tightened. Still, Margot maintained her innocence. The torture escalated. Red-hot needles were driven under what remained of her fingernails. Her feet were placed in iron boots that were gradually heated over a fire. The metal conducted the heat directly to her flesh, cooking her from the outside in. Her toes were literally roasted inside the contraption. For 2 weeks, this systematic destruction continued. Margot's body was methodically dismantled piece by piece. Her captors showed a creativity and cruelty that speaks to the dehumanization of the peasant class. She was no longer seen as a person, but as an object to be broken. When Margot finally died, it was not from any single injury, but from the accumulation of trauma and infection. Her body had simply reached its limit. Even then, her torment wasn't over. Her corpse was dragged through the village streets and burned in a public ceremony, her ashes scattered to prevent her spirit from returning. These stories represent just the beginning of our journey into the darkest aspects of medieval life. The systematic brutality faced by serfs and peasants reveals a society where human worth was determined entirely by birth and social position. But these two cases pale in comparison to what's coming next. Wait until you hear about the mass executions that followed the peasant uprisings, where entire families were subjected to tortures that lasted for days. The year 1381 brought one of the most devastating peasant uprisings in English history. What started as protests against oppressive poll taxes erupted into full-scale rebellion across the countryside. When the revolt was finally crushed, the retribution that followed would demonstrate medieval brutality at its absolute worst. In the village of Billeriquet, a group of serfs had dared to burn the manor house and kill their lord's bailiff. When royal forces arrived to restore order, they found the peasants barricaded inside the village church. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most savage acts of collective punishment ever recorded. The soldiers sealed the church doors with iron bars and heavy stones. Inside, 43 men, women, and children waited in growing terror as smoke began seeping through cracks in the ancient walls. The attackers had set fire to bundles of straw and pitch placed around the building's perimeter. As flames engulfed the wooden roof, panic erupted inside families pressed against the barred doors, clawing desperately at the wood until their fingernails tore away and blood streaked the oak planks. The temperature rose steadily as burning timber crashed down from above. Those trapped inside faced an impossible choice. Some threw themselves against the walls until bones cracked and skulls split open against the stone. Others tried to climb toward the high windows, only to fall back into the writhing mass of humanity below. Children's screams mixed with the prayers of adults as the air grew thick with smoke and ash. The lucky ones died quickly from smoke inhalation, but many others lingered as the fire consumed their clothing and flesh. Witnesses outside reported hearing the sounds for over an hour before silence finally fell. When the doors were opened days later, investigators found bodies fused together by melted fat and charred bone. Some victims were discovered in corners where they had tried to shield their children from the flames. But individual villages were not the only targets of this systematic revenge. Entire regions faced coordinated campaigns of terror designed to crush any future thoughts of rebellion. In Norfolk, a serf named Thomas Grendel was captured while trying to flee across the county border. Grendel had been a leader in his village's uprising, convincing fellow peasants to refuse their labor obligations and demand wage increases. His capture presented an opportunity for authorities to send a message that would reach every corner of the realm. The execution was planned as public theater. A special platform was constructed in Norwich Market Square, elevated so that spectators could witness every detail of what was to come. Grendel was brought before the crowd in chains, his clothes torn, and his body already bearing marks from preliminary beatings. The sentence was read aloud in both Latin and English to ensure everyone understood the charges: treason against the crown, incitement to rebellion, destruction of property. Each crime carried its own specific punishment, and all would be carried out in sequence. First came the flaying, using specially sharpened knives, Executioners began peeling away strips of skin from Grendel's arms and legs. The process was deliberately slow, each cut measured to maximize pain while keeping him conscious. Blood ran down his limbs and pooled on the wooden platform as spectators watched in horrified fascination. When both arms had been stripped to the muscle, they moved to his torso. The chest proved more challenging, requiring deeper cuts to separate skin from the underlying tissue. Grendel's screams had long since given way to hoarse gasping as his voice box failed from strain. The flaying continued for nearly 2 hours. By the end, Grendel resembled something inhuman, his exposed muscles glistening red in the afternoon sunlight. Incredibly, he remained alive throughout the ordeal, his eyes still tracking the movements of his tormentors. The second phase involved salt. Coarse crystals were rubbed into every exposed wound, causing fresh agony as the mineral burned into raw flesh. Grendel's body convulsed violently against his restraints as waves of pain crashed over him. Spectators reported that his back arched so severely they feared his spine might snap. But the authorities were not finished. Hot pitch was brought forward in iron cauldrons, the black substance bubbling and smoking as it was ladled onto wooden paddles. This molten tar was then spread across Grendel's wounds, sealing them closed while simultaneously burning deeper into his flesh. The smell was overwhelming. Burning skin mixed with the acrid odor of tar created a nauseating cloud that hung over the market square. Many spectators vomited or fainted, but the guards forced everyone to remain and witness the full display. Death finally came when the executioners drove iron spikes through Grendel's heart. Even then, his body continued twitching for several minutes as life slowly ebbed away. The corpse was left hanging from the platform for a full week, a decomposing reminder of royal authority. These examples reveal the calculated nature of medieval violence against the lower classes. Death was rarely quick or merciful. Instead, it served as entertainment for some and education for others. The message was clear: challenge the established order and face consequences beyond imagination. These accounts from medieval history strip away the romantic myths we tell ourselves about the past. Guillaume, Margot, Thomas Grendel, and the 43 souls burned alive in Billericay Church represent millions of forgotten lives crushed beneath the weight of absolute power. Their deaths were not accidents of war or natural disasters, but calculated acts of terror designed to maintain social control. What makes these stories particularly chilling is their systematic nature. This wasn't random violence born from passion or desperation. It was institutionalized cruelty, sanctioned by law and blessed by religious authority. The creativity displayed in torture methods reveals minds that had spent considerable time perfecting the art of human suffering. These weren't isolated incidents, but routine expressions of medieval justice. For every documented case that survived in court records and monastery chronicles, countless others vanished into unmarked graves and forgotten memories. The true scale of suffering endured by serfs and peasants will never be fully known. Understanding this dark history serves a purpose beyond mere shock value. It reminds us how fragile human dignity becomes when power operates without accountability. The peasants who died in agony weren't fundamentally different from us. They loved their families, felt pain and fear, and clung to hope even in their final moments. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as entertainment, but as testament to the human cost of unchecked authority.